Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I will be providing my book review of the book Star Trek Strange New Worlds: The High Country by John Jackson Miller, a new release book that is the first book in what I hope will be many books in the Star Trek Strange New Worlds line of novels. This book was delayed significantly. It was supposed to come out in November. Then they delayed it all the way to February because of printing issues. And as such, they had to make adjustments along with those printing issues, which I'll talk about. But I do want to talk a little bit first about Star Trek hardcovers, and then also about John Jackson Miller and Star Trek novels. Because when you're doing a Star Trek novel, there are certain expectations. When you are doing the first book in a new Star Trek series, there are even bigger expectations upon you. And then if you're doing the first book in a new Star Trek series that is out in hardcover, the expectations are through the roof. For comparison's sake, like there were a lot of hardcovers released in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even a little bit in the early 2000s. For Star Trek, I'm thinking of ones like Imzadi, which is, you can tell it's a smaller hardcover as comparison, but it was still a hardcover, and those were big deals, and they made them event books typically. They were a big deal if you got a hardcover, because they were releasing at the time only a few books, or they were releasing maybe like a book a month, or sometimes 2 books a month. As such, if you got a big hardcover, it was a big deal. And then we went a long time in the 2000s and 2010s without hardcovers. Even the movie novelizations were still paperbacks. Until we got the first Picard novel was released as a hardcover, Star Trek Picard: The Last Best Hope. Ironically, I don't own the hardcover of it. I bought it when it came out in paperback because it was at a used bookstore like the week after it came out. It was super weird that it went that the paperback was in the used bookstore so quickly. But this originally came in a hardcover. I'm still looking for an affordable one, but this originally came out in hardcover. And it was a big deal, and it sold a lot of copies. And so they decided to make the Star Trek Picard line hardcover, and I have 2 of the 3 other Picard novels that have been released. One of them is Picard Rogue Elements, and the other is Star Trek Second Self by Rogue Elements by John Jackson Miller, and Second Self by Una McCormack. But when they decided to do the Strange New Worlds line of books, they decided to make them event hardcovers like they had the Picard novels, which meant that there was a lot of expectation on this book. And I think that this book delivers on the expectation because it is a full, complete, big story, but it fits within the Strange New Worlds continuity and universe. It doesn't feel like it's in the wrong place. Sometimes you read a book and you're like, this is a great book, has no place in this series. That happens sometimes, but that is not the case here. Here, this novel works because it fits in the Strange New Worlds line of books, and it just tells a really entertaining story. So I've talked about like the setup for doing a hardcover. Now talking about John Jackson Miller. He's done a lot of Star Trek. He's done 7 previous Star Trek novels. Back when they did mass market paperbacks, he did 4. And then of recently, he's done 3. He did Die Standing, which is the novel featuring Emperor Georgiou, which is such an entertaining book. Really way more entertaining than it has any right being. Then you have the hardcover for Picard, Rogue Elements, which is a smaller scale story. It's like a fun adventure with a humorous Han Solo type character, Cristobal Rios. Despite being a hardcover, this one did not really strike the fandom in the same way that some of the other Picard hardcovers have, so it has not gotten as many reviews on Amazon or Goodreads, which is a crying shame because it's a great novel with surprising themes, deep themes, and heart. The other recent novel that he did, and I did these out of order because I wanted this one to be last, was The Enterprise War, which was a new book for the Discovery line featuring Pike, Una, and Spock, and the rest of the Enterprise crew. This was the book that explained where they were during the Klingon War, so it had a big deal ahead of it. And so when I read this book and a lot of other fans read this book, we thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if they did a series featuring Pike and Una and Spock and all those characters. And then we got that series. They announced we're getting Strange New Worlds, which was a big deal because fans loved it. It was a fan. They made it for the fans. And then we thought, you know what? John Jackson Miller, he wrote the novel that features them. He's the perfect person to lead off. And I had a few friends in the Star Trek readers group that we were all like, they've got to give it to him. They've got to give it to him. And sure enough, they did. So he was someone who's no stranger to Star Trek, no stranger to the Pike character and to Spock and to Una and to the rest of the cast. And so he was the absolute perfect person to pick to lead off this book. So let's get into the book a little bit. I want to avoid spoilers. I won't be going deep into spoilers here, but I have some thoughts on the book. This book, for one thing, is very much like a self-contained book. There's no big. You don't need to have been heavily invested into other books to read this. You really don't even have to have seen the TV series. And I spent a good time away from the Star Trek TV shows, including Strange New Worlds, because I just wasn't feeling them. And just recently, I jumped back in with Picard Season 3 because I'm loving it and it's amazing. But I have not yet watched Strange New Worlds. So it's kind of funny that I've been talking about all this without having actually watched the show. I've watched clips, I should say. I've watched clips, but not the actual show. So I don't know the TV show as well, and yet I was able to perfectly follow everything in this book because John Jackson Miller writes every book as if someone is new to the universe, and he did a great job in that. Also, this book is a complete story. It feels epic and big, and part of that is because this book is kind of deceiving in how short it looks. The book is only about 370 pages, which some of his books, page-wise, have been longer. Enterprise War was about 400 pages, and Picard, which John Jackson Miller claimed as his longest novel, was also about 400 pages. But this Picard Rogue Elements novel had a larger font, whereas the High Country has a really small font, And if you compare it to Star Trek's Picard's Second Self, oh man, is this a large font. The font difference between this is huge. It's kind of like you can see, this is like the big font, and then this is kind of medium standard font, and this is the really teeny tiny font. And I mentioned the printing issues that came in with doing this book, and those printing issues were that I actually asked John about this on Twitter, and it was that they didn't have the paper, and it was hard getting all the binding and whatnot, and so they decreased the font so that they could cut out the number of pages that they could cut out. They wanted to be economical in their use, which I can very much understand from the publisher. As someone who does, analytics and looks at the numbers and word counts and all that stuff, it really frustrates me because I have to change my metrics. Just keep everything the same font. Keep everything the same. Why is this so hard? But I understand from a business standpoint why they had to do it. And as such, this book in reality should be 420, 430, maybe even 440 pages. I saw one person online estimate that they did the math at 460. I don't think I agree with their math there, but it's in the 400 range. So it's a longer book. But there's a lot of story in here. We're primarily following these three characters, and really there's a fourth character, Uhura, who we're following. But it's really Pike takes the lion's share of the book from his perspective, and then Una, number one, she has about most of the rest of it, and then Spock and Uhura get a little bit of time. But they're all four of them are stranded on this planet where no technology works, so they cannot reach Enterprise, they cannot get off planet, they're stuck there. And it's very much a science fiction trope. You're on a planet where no technology works. That is a tried and true trope. But what works here is because you're really getting to explore the entire planet. John Jackson Miller was able to explore the mountains and the valleys and the oceans and the islands and the glaciers and the deserts. You see all the biomes. You see what an entire planet is like. But then you also see the alien nature of the planet. You see the world building. It truly feels, it's not just our world under another name or something. It's actually a unique world building system that works really well. It's like there's some fantasy elements to this book. At the same time, it feels like a good sci-fi book. But it does not have that monobiome problem that is just awful in tie-in fiction often. And it doesn't have, and it feels like we're getting a full story. Sometimes you get like a planet hopping thing, like for The Last Best Hope. This is an amazing novel, but it's so short, and you feel like, man, there was so much more story you could have told. And even I think that they thought that story is told in the TV show, but it's not. We wanted more story from this book. And this one, you won't feel like you need that story because it's all in here. You meet a lot of excellent characters along the way. I'd be very careful not to spoil why those characters are so great, but there are some great characters along the way, heroes and villains alike. But this book has a lot of Western themes. And I know that in Star Wars we've gotten a little bit saturated with Western themes, but John Jackson Miller wrote Kenobi, which was the Star Wars tie-in fiction novel that not only was a New York Times bestseller, but also was a Scribe Award winner, as have been some of his other Star Trek novels. And this book had those Western elements, but it felt on a bigger scope. Whereas in Star Wars, he's just following Kenobi in this little area of Tatooine. You're seeing continents being discussed in Strange New Worlds. So it feels like a big new book, a big new planet that you're really getting to explore. There are some great themes about technology and the use of technology and how we view technology in our future that I think that this book really handles well. There's also discussions about what is good for the greater good, and at one point do you sacrifice personal freedom to help the greater good? That is a very difficult question to answer, because sometimes the answer is sometimes you have to take away people's freedom in order to do the right thing that'll help them in the future, and sometimes people need complete freedom, and you may think you know better than them, but you don't. It is an interesting line to walk, and that is discussed very heavily here. And on both ends, they're not cheesy at all. They're both told very well. So on all those elements, this story worked really well. On the themes, the world building, the characters, I thought Pike was written really well. I thought Una was. I thought that the minor characters that they had to interact with were good. There is one criticism I have of the book is there's one character who shows up towards the beginning of the book, and she's a big part of the book for probably the first third of it, first half of the book. And then all of a sudden she just disappears. And then she reappears at the end of the book, and it's not like an Ex Machina type thing. It's not a big spoiler or anything, but I was like, why did you disappear and this other person took their place? It really should have just been that character that I'm mentioning that disappeared. It should have been them from the start. They shouldn't have left the story at all. And I understand kind of why John Jackson Miller wrote it this way, but I would have had the other character involved throughout, because she was the anchor, I felt, for the story from the people on the planet's perspective. And instead, we didn't really have that anchor. We had someone else serving as the anchor. So that is a criticism I do have of the book, but that's a minor criticism in the grand scope of things, because this is just an entertaining book. I will say a few things. This book does have some maps. It has 5 maps inside, which this is the first book in 23 years to have, for Star Trek book in 23 years to have maps. And it was entertaining and very cool. Now, if you're listening to the audiobook or ebook, you don't need to see the maps, but if you do, it really enhances the experience and makes you feel like you're seeing an entire world on this planet. Now, some other thoughts and comments I had. This book does not have the language or sexual elements that the Picard novels had, and that was a really frustrating thing in the Picard novels, and even to some extent in the Discovery novels that I found really frustrating. And it's just something that shouldn't, in my opinion, shouldn't be in Star Trek, but it had to be included in these because that's what the editors mandate. But I'm glad that this book didn't have to have any of that, because it's a nice, clean, well-written, fun Star Trek book that is big. This feels like a big Star Trek book, and it was the perfect book to lead off the Strange New Worlds series. So overall, I'm gushing about this book. The last thing I want to mention is there is a quote in the book that was just superb, and I don't want to say who says it or where they say it or why they say it entirely, but I just want to say this quote, and if you've read the book, you probably know what this quote is referencing, but it is just, this quote ends a scene, and it was like a boom, mic drop. The fate you are describing is a fate that many have suffered, but in your case, at least, it will have been earned. Such a good line, especially when you know it in context. So there's actually quite a few humorous moments too. There are quite a few humorous moments throughout the book, and great references to our history and mythology of our world. So overall, loved this book. I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. Not a perfect Star Trek novel, but man, was it entertaining. Really enjoyed it. Can't wait to see more Strange New Worlds novels and hopefully more John Jackson Miller novels. And I would say if you're like a Star Wars person that doesn't read too much Star Trek, and specifically you liked Kenobi, you'll probably like this because there's a lot of touchstones that'll make you think, oh, I kind of see his writing style from Kenobi evolving here into Strange New Worlds. So I think you'll really be fascinated by it. So I loved this book. Gave it a huge recommendation. If you've read it, let me know all your thoughts in the comments. I really can't wait to talk spoilers about this book because there's so many great spoilers. I can't wait to talk about this book. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.